This is Tom Fox. Welcome to a special 5-part podcast series on the fight to secure supply chains through cross-industry innovation. This podcast series is sponsored by Exiger. In this series, we will explore the ongoing efforts of Exiger to lead the discussion and enhancement of supply chain risk management. First, a word about Exiger's Supply Chain Explorer. Today, risk management professionals and procurement professionals are swamped. A new artificial intelligence risk detection tool is helping Fortune 500 companies and government agencies surface, understand, and mitigate critical threats to their third-party and supplier networks literally within hours. Introducing Supply Chain Explorer, a groundbreaking AI platform developed by Exiger, a leading global risk and compliance SaaS company. Exiger Supply Chain Explorer is a next-generation platform built on award-winning AI that delivers instantaneous transparency, allowing you to meet the urgent imperative to protect global supply chains from sanctions, ESG, and cyber risk at unprecedented speed and scale. With single-click supply chain detection, high-level due diligence, and risk analysis, everyone can now join the fight to secure our global supply chains. For the first time, you can even spot potential disruptions before they impact your supply chain. Check out Exiger's Supply Chain Explorer. In this episode, I'm joined by Jennifer Nestor and Theresa Campobasso to look at supply chain issues in the defense industrial base. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back again with another episode. And today I have with me Jennifer Nestor and Theresa Campobasso, both from Exiger. And we are going to take a look at some of the issues that they are discussing with their clients around third parties and third-party risk management tools. So before we get started, could you guys tell us what your current roles are with Exiger? And Jennifer, could I start with you?
Yes. Good afternoon, Tom. Thanks for having us today on the podcast. So Jennifer Nestor, I'm a senior director at Exiger, and I'm currently leading the effort to reach out to the DIBs, the Defense Industrial Base, and work with them to bring in supply chain risk management tools in-house to look at their third parties, to look at their supply chain, and really gain some transparency across their programs.
And Theresa?
Sure. Hi, Theresa Campobasso. I am a Senior Director of Defense Programs at Exiger Government. So I'm also working in the supply chain risk management and third-party risk management with a defense focus. But where Jen is primarily engaging with our defense industrial base customers directly, I'm working more with our defense federal organization customers. So we do work very closely together, two halves of the same coin there.
And one of the reasons I was excited to visit with both of you all is that many of the audience or listeners to this podcast come from the corporate sector. And what I've found in visiting with your colleagues at Exiger over the years is that in many ways, the defense industrial space leads and is more innovative than the corporate sector, particularly around risk management issues. So it's a long-winded way of introducing that you guys are going to focus on something a little bit different, but for the compliance professional or a corporate officer who's listening to this, there's lots of insights that Exiger and these two individuals have done that really inform a compliance program. So with that, Jen, if I can maybe ask you, what's the difference in a DIBS, now that we've defined that role, in a supply chain?
Okay, thank you. The DIB is different from other sectors for a number of reasons, but today I really wanted to highlight two of those. The first is the DIB's unique relationship to national security missions. For those new to defense, the DIB consists of well over 100,000 companies, and its role is massive. It includes defense R&D, production, delivery, and maintenance of military weapon systems, sensors, and other critical technology. This direct impact to U.S. national security means that the resilience and stability of the DIB and its supply chain is critical to ensure U.S. economic security and military technological superiority. Unlike other sectors, the U.S. defense community's ability to protect our nation rests in large part on the DIB's actions related to risk management, supply chain risk management, and their efforts to fortify that supply chain. The second differentiator is the high rates of foreign adversary targeting that the DIB companies experience as opposed to a lot of other standard commercial organizations. Foreign intelligence actors, like nation states, organizations, or individuals, employ really aggressive actions like foreign investment, M&A activity, espionage, and cyber operations to gain access to the U.S.'s critical infrastructure and to steal sensitive information and just overall to disrupt our supply chain.
So as I mentioned in the preface to the last question, many of the issues that you guys face in the defense industry in the supply chain are in many ways leading or more innovative than in corporate America. And the emphasis on national security is certainly one. And I don't think many in the corporate space realize that they have a national security interest. But if they're in healthcare, if they're in energy, and if they're in tech, they're in you name the industry, they now have a national security interest. So my next question really is, I'm really interested in, Jen, which is you've articulated what I think were many of the concerns and differences in the defense industry and supply chain before the last 2 years or even the last 6 months. But what has changed now for supply chain risk management that makes these issues even more critical in your opinion?
Absolutely. Over the last year plus, we've seen a lot of heightened regulatory standards related to supply chain due diligence, which directly impacts the DIB. We've seen the increasing complexity of global supply chains, which has impacted all of us. And really what we're here to talk about today is the growing availability of actionable data deep into the sub-tier supply chain. The only way the DIB can ensure that they're supporting DoD's acquisition strategy and the evolving regulations is by investing in technology. That's the only way they can really gain transparency, map their supply chains, and really gain insights into those relationships deep into the sub-tier supply chain. That's exactly what we do at Exiger. We provide supply chain illuminations. We're looking not only, as Theresa mentioned, on the government side, but we're looking at the DIB's direct and indirect exposure, both on goods, parts, materials from foreign adversaries and nation state actors. This allows our clients to map that sub-tier supply chain and give them insights on things that before you never had that level of insight. It's things like counterfeit parts, compromise of intellectual property, and theft of critical technology. So a big change in the data that's out there and in the transparency.
Theresa, if I could turn to you and ask about the U.S. government's role in driving DIB's investment in supply chain risk management, and then perhaps even ask what could be done to get us all there faster?
That is a great question. So Jen mentioned some of this as well, but we've really seen a recent increase in policies like some of the executive orders and other regulations and compliance over the last couple of years, particularly the last 2 years. And these are really intended to address a lot of the much needed supply chain security reforms after these really high profile compromises. Think of the SolarWinds attack, or the Colonial Pipeline hack, or big things like that. And a lot of these proposed higher standards do put the responsibility on the DIB to prove and kind of provide evidence of this level of supply chain transparency and risk management. And I'll give you an example here. A recent policy example is going to be the Weaker Forced Label Prevention Act. So this was signed December of 2021, and it requires vendors doing business with the government to establish and present evidence that any goods provided are not the product of forced labor. So if you imagine a company providing any product to the U.S. government and that has maybe some supply chain exposure to this region, they now have to provide evidence that not only are they not directly involved with forced labor, but now that they also have to provide evidence that their entire supply chain that touches their products, from raw material all the way through design, manufacture, delivery, are not connected either. So as Jen mentioned, the data availability is going to be the only way we can really do this, right? It requires the detailed data, supply chain mapping and illumination, and really rapid risk assessment. Another example would be a more recent February 2022 DoD action plan, and that's to secure the defense critical supply chains. So the DoD is heavily investing in supply chain data themselves, and that's really because previously, the DoD really relied on and the federal government writ large, really relied on self-attestation. They would go to these companies and rely on the companies to then tell them, yes, I am secure, got great risk management, got great cybersecurity, I am a safe company to do business with. The DoD is now trying to collect objective evidence to take more of a trust but verify role. And then the last thing I would say would be FARs and DFARS clauses. So anyone looking to do business with the government is going to be familiar with these. These are contractual mechanisms that the government is actually using or exploring use to incentivize DIB companies to provide scrim transparency and risk management right up front, right before the acquisition happens. So that is going to probably result in increased investment by DIB companies in these effective scrim solutions so that the government sees them as trusted, low-risk candidates to receive government awards. I would say the best way to get there more quickly would be to acknowledge that this is something that is going to benefit both financially and from a security standpoint the DIB organization in question, and to get really smart on solutions, lean in, be proactive, do some pilots, explore solutions, and don't wait till compliance comes down and tells you you must do this. Get ahead of the problem and show the government or show your other customers that you are committed to reducing supply chain risk and third-party risk.
Theresa, I don't think you've ever heard me give a speech, but if you had, you will know that I always say the three most important things in any compliance program are the following: document, document, document. Does that concept translate over now into the type of work you're doing with DIBs in the context of their obligations under both of this legislation and action plans that you've detailed as well?
I would say yes. So with regard to kind of how Exiger is working with the defense community, both on the federal side and the DIB side, we're looking to quickly surface these types of hidden risks and provide that documentation so that there's full transparency and you don't have to go back and forth and argue about what is and isn't a risk, right? And you can also collect that evidence to make a proactive risk determination and take action before something becomes a problem. So we believe that a truly effective supply chain risk management solution has to be based on that full transparency, but it also has to have the widest aperture of risk indicators. So more than just sanctions, more than just watch list checks, really hundreds of indicators across the broadest set of categories, but then also a way to measure the improvement. So looking at not just having the tool to measure and assess the risk indicators and to provide that documentation, that transparency, but also to provide a framework, a risk framework, and at Exiger we use a proprietary trades framework to look at how organizations can test that they are actually making an impact over time and their actions that they're taking in their compliance are actually contributing to increased supply chain security.
Ed, you touched on this briefly, but do you find that by going through this process, a DIB can become more business efficient and business resilient because they understand who is in their supply chain, literally to the person or company that may dig the mineral out of the ground? And that by having that information, they can see where they may have risk, but also where they could increase efficiency. Is that a conversation you're having with your DIB clients?
Absolutely. And I'll also have Jen touch on this as well, because I know she works a lot with DIB customers on this. I talked about the broadest aperture of supply chain risk indicators. And one of those categories of risk indicators is going to be operational risk. I know I talked a lot about security and I mentioned cyber, and we talked about transparency and forced labor and ESG risk. But operational risk and financial risk are really legitimate supply chain concerns. And if people are not constantly doing continuous evaluation and continuous monitoring of these types of risks as part of their full supply chain risk management program, they're going to miss a lot of opportunities to take action before something becomes a problem, to either prevent a disruption, identify a lower risk or a more efficient supplier, and create some efficiencies as part of this process as well. But I'll see if Jen agrees with me.
Yes, I absolutely agree. By mapping not only the first tier, but that sub-tier supply chain, it provides transparency for the DIB. They're seeing the risks across all of these entities, and it allows them to really recognize where they need to apply their time, money, resources, which companies or suppliers they want to get out of their supply chain, right, to prevent further risks down the road, which are more expensive. And as you mentioned, right, try to find additional efficiencies. So absolutely, that's a great question.
Jen, if I could turn to you and ask, how is the DIB community or even your client base really responding to these government-led changes about supply chain standards, or is it really an ongoing dialogue?
It absolutely is an ongoing dialogue, but we are seeing the large DIBs. They're embracing the standards. They're moving out. They're looking to acquire an enterprise solution. They're excited to bring in-house tech AI solutions that make them more efficient, right? If you have to all of a sudden look at 1,000 or 10,000 companies, you need a solution that helps you triage that data, understand the risks, and make sense of it in a really efficient way. One interesting thing is that normally procurement decisions, right, they're led by the procurement team or compliance team, but we're seeing the DIB bring 20 plus stakeholders across C-suite, across the various functions. They recognize, right, there isn't one team that owns these functions. They're spread across the business. They're spread across the functions. And so we're seeing these companies lean in and want to have the right people at the table to get familiar with the tool, to get familiar with the data, and to evaluate, how do we bring this in-house? How do we operationalize it? How do we do business in a better way? I would say for any DIB out there or any company out there that hasn't started this process of evaluating how transformative this technology can be for you, reach out, schedule a demo, make us prove it to you, the level of insights that you're going to gain and how much better you're going to be able to run your business in support of both internal and also your clients. And then the last thing is we know Scrim Solutions, they're in a financial investment, right? They are not always cheap. And to do it the right way, you need to look broadly across your organization. So we see the DIB trying to figure out what's the right level of due diligence they need, not only for compliance reasons, but also to be a reliable, stable company, both internally and for their clients. And they're trying to figure out, right? There's tons of more deep data they've never had access before. So they're trying to figure out, how do I action this data? How do I implement and affect things deeper into my sub-tier supply chain? So it's an exciting discussion to have. We're seeing the wheels turning, and we're part of that solution, and we're having that conversation across the DIB.
Theresa, we started out this conversation talking about DIBs and national security. And anytime you talk about national security, I think you have to talk about national security risk. And we are in a heightened national security risk situation now, particularly over the last, I guess now 3 months because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, although that is an ongoing conversation in your community. So I wanted to maybe ask, how are DIBs responding to this heightened level of supply chain risks around national security, or is it even much broader than national security?
Outstanding. Keeping up with the effect of current events, whether it's geopolitical events, catastrophic weather events, any kind of dynamic external kind of macro or imposed risk on a supply chain or on a network of third parties is a longstanding challenge. And it's one that we've also kind of struggled with Jen and myself, in our time, our previous lives when we were both on the government side. I would say that we see DIB community or DIB organizations and also defense organizations both responding to these dynamic changes in the current threat environment in two main ways. I think that the first is going to be to change their organizational mindset. And I know that this is always a large strategic change, takes a lot of time. And as Jen mentioned, there's a lot of stakeholders involved, so that the change is slow. But we do see these organizations are trying to move away from just a very narrow kind of checklist-based mindset for threat risk management to a more threat-based risk management approach. What I mean by that is, it's one thing to say, okay, well, here's the letter of the law, and I'm going to very narrowly define risk just as I'm required to, and I'm going to only limit myself to looking at this very narrow definition. Now, compliance is obviously incredibly important, and I'm not saying that that is not, a really good focus to have. But I think what we're seeing is some people are abusing compliance as an excuse to really limit the way that they define risk and the way that they measure risk and evaluate risk and take action against risk. And so now, because I think of the wide nature of different types of supply chain risks and third-party risks and how we see them affecting risk profiles in companies and in products and in software and in services and people even in the supply chain, have started that organizational shift to a broader aperture, which is wonderful. The more broadly you can define it, the more likely you are to proactively measure it and get ahead of it, and the less likely it is to be able to disrupt your operations or your business or to introduce some kind of a risk into your clients. And then the second is kind of the converse of that. I would say, as much as we're seeing these really exciting conversations and these really exciting developments around new understandings of risk, we also see some organizational change resistance. So, again, Jen had mentioned the variety of stakeholders, and while that's so important, getting consensus can be difficult when you're talking to an insider threat professional versus a contracts or compliance professional versus enterprise risk management. Not everybody's always speaking the same language. So, Tom, to your earlier point, being able to get that core documentation and that transparency and that data that really is indisputable and actionable is going to be the best, quickest way to bring everyone together and focus on the true drivers of the problem and make those decisions and then evaluate how the program is doing in reducing risk over time.
So unfortunately, we are near the end of our time for this episode, but I was wondering if our listeners wanted any more information on any of the topics we've touched on Exiger, on really the DIB work that both of you all are doing, what would be the best way to find out?
So we have a great website. It is exiger.com. You're going to be able to get links to request demos. You're going to be able to see all of our latest thought leadership on supply chain and on a lot of the topics that we touched on today. Our professionals do make a pretty regular appearance on the conference circuit related to risk management, compliance, third-party risk, defense, national security, and cybersecurity. So if there are any upcoming events, you're welcome to find that information on our website as well. You can connect with us on LinkedIn. But yes, please reach out. Jen had mentioned this as well. Schedule a demo. We'd love to talk to you. And we are excited to connect with your audience. Thank you.
And I wanted to thank you both for taking the time to visit with me. It's been a great episode, and I look forward to continuing this conversation.
Thank you so much, Tom.
Thank you, Tom.
I hope you will join me tomorrow when we conclude our 5-part series on Exiger's fight to secure supply chain by taking a look at supply chain issues in energy. You can join the fight to secure our global supply chain by obtaining early access trial licenses to Exiger Supply Chain Explorer by visiting exiger.com, and we've linked to the site on the show notes. You can also find out how Exiger is making the world a safer and more effective place to do business by following Exiger on LinkedIn or reaching out to any of the experts featured on today's podcast. This special 5-part series has been a production of the Compliance Podcast Network.